Stick around for the very big Anything Ghost Halloween special. Talk to you soon! A story from Andy in Toronto, Ontario. The Poltergeist on Cartwright Street. Back in 2000 to 2003, my friend lived in an apartment in the upstairs of a house while he was going to the university in London, Ontario. The apartment was quite small. It had a small living room, a tiny bathroom, a tiny kitchen, and a tiny bedroom. Needless to say, it was pretty tiny. But we could get a dozen people in there at a time, and because of the proximity of the house to downtown, it was the central hangout for a lot of our friends. One night there were a few of us hanging out watching TV, when all of a sudden, the tap in the bathroom turned on. I asked my friend, whose apartment it was, why his tap had just turned on by itself. He told me that it happens all the time, and just assumed it was something to do with the plumbing. He got up and turned the tap off. One of the next times it happened, as soon as the tap went on, I rushed to the bathroom to see for myself. It was an old sink with a separate hot and cold faucet. The hot faucet was turned all the way on, blasting steaming hot water. So I turned it off. It took 2 to 3 full turns to shut it off. One of the stranger things about it was, because it was upstairs of an older house, it would take a fair amount of time for the water to get hot. But when it turned on by itself, it would be steaming hot. Not to mention the handle would have to have been rotated several times to turn it to that full blast. This went on for years after the incident that I witnessed. It would turn on so much that we became desensitized to it. My friend at the apartment was a bit of a neat freak, because his apartment was so small. He kept it very tidy, including his tiny kitchen. One evening, a few of us left his place to go to a few bars and meet some friends. At the end of the night, I decided to crash on my friend's couch because I was a bit too drunk and didn't want to drive home. When we got up to his apartment, we both went into the kitchen to grab a few beers from the fridge. That's where we found all his kitchen cupboards open and all the plates, cups, bowls, and cutlery piled and stacked on the counter and in the sink, as if someone were going to wash all the dishes after a big meal. Somehow, this had happened while we were out, with zero explanation of how it happened. He did say that he'd come home to other times and found his cupboards and kitchen a mess like that, too. There were also other times that we'd be sitting watching TV, and there'd be a knock on his door downstairs. When one of us would go to see who it was, most of the time, there was nobody there. I personally was there for many of those incidents, and even answered an empty doorway a few times, too. It's especially disappointing when you think it's the pizza guy. This also became so commonplace that when someone would go down and find an empty doorway, they'd yell up, "False alarm, guys! It's just the ghost." This next story is from Alicio in San Antonio, Texas. The incorporeal wagon, and other strange happenings. I was born and raised in the small town of Mathis, Texas. A small town in South Texas, located some 50 miles from the coast. And I spent my formative years in a small yellow house at a dead end. Our little dead-end street was surrounded on both sides by thick brush, cacti, and gnarled mesquite trees. It was here that I experienced many strange sightings and heard sounds that I found hard to explain. Sounds in the kitchen became a nightly occurrence. It sounded as if somebody was shifting the dishes in the dish rack back and forth needlessly. These noises happened so often, they simply became a background noise that went largely unnoticed. At such a young age, many of the occurrences seemed to be quite normal, warranting no questions, while other experiences at the house would later terrify me. In those days, I had a tendency to go outside with my siblings to stargaze and walk about at night. On one such night, I was outside alone. My nightly need to explore the large world around would soon turn to terror as I neared the mesquite woods. I was walking along the dark wooded area when suddenly felt the all too eerie feeling of being watched. I looked about, searching for a source. Looking to the woods at my side, an unexpected pair of glowing eyes were nestled in the shadows between two large mesquite branches that forked from the same base roots. The eyes seemed to hover at a very high altitude, as if the thing hung in the trees looking down at me. Needless to say, I was terrified and doubled back inside. I explained to my mother that there was a large, scary animal in the woods. One of the most common apparitions I witnessed were the shadow figures. I saw the shadows of people walking by our windows very consistently. They never really bothered me until one night. I was lying in bed with my mother, who, unfortunately, had fallen fast asleep before me. The master bedroom looked directly into the living room where, located in the center, there was a long glass coffee table. Turning about, trying to find a comfortable position, I momentarily glanced into the living room, where something caught my eye. Now curious, I turned my focus to the living room, only to see the shadow of a man standing in the center of the room. The figure stood there for a few seconds, turned, and quickly walked away toward the hallway, paying no heed to the glass coffee table that should have impeded his movement. Terrified, I quickly threw the sheets over my head, tried my hardest to fall asleep. The sleep that I looked for at refuge at times would betray me in my teen years, when I began to experience sleep paralysis. My teen years brought a few other unexplained experiences that happened while I was wide awake. Though I had long since stopped seeing the shadow people, I began seeing a tall white man with short blonde hair that would periodically walk by our front window. The first couple of times I saw him, I thought maybe a stranger had wandered into the yard. I would open the front door to glance outside, only to find no one there. None of these experiences would prepare me for the most terrifying experience that was yet to come. I was home alone one night, reading in my room. I heard a noise, at first distant, but very distant. It was the sound of a wagon being pulled by a horse. At first I barely noticed it, as my full attention was on the book at hand. The noise grew louder. My focus on the book swayed, as my interest in the passing wagon was sparked. I chalked it up to maybe some kind of oddly timed Amish excursion in the middle of the night. I didn't think too hard on the matter. The noise grew louder and louder, as if the wagon had come down our street to the dead end. Now I was confused, because why would a wagon come down this way? It simply made no sense. I wasn't scared yet, just curious. I put down my book, walked over to the window, and peeked through the blinds. To my surprise, I saw nothing. How could this be? I clearly heard a wagon being pulled by a horse. I was dumbfounded. I thought for a second maybe somebody left the TV on in the living room. My hopes for a simple answer to this strange anomaly were quickly crushed as the sound of the wagon grew closer. I stepped back and cowered in the corner, waiting for a horse and wagon to burst through my window. The wagon was now just outside my window. I could hear the wheels slowly turning in the dirt and the sound of the hooves as they hit the ground. The wagon was now in my house. For the first time and only time in my life, I was petrified. The wagon crept through the windows and into the living room, making its way through the kitchen and out the back, ignoring any boundaries set by our house's walls. Able to move again, I made my way out to the back of the house and looked out the window. I could still hear the wagon creeping away into the night. I would later share my experience with my mother. She responded unsurprised by my tale, claiming she and one of my aunts had heard the very same thing one night while next door. This revelation blew my mind. For a few months I thought maybe I was going crazy, but now I had a confirmation that I was not the only person who experienced the strange happening. Upon further investigation, I found that long before the town had been established, there was a network of cattle trails and even a fort not far north that was built on the banks of the river by the army to protect the settlers from the Comanche raids. Maybe the wagon is simply an echo from the not-too-distant past. Whatever the wagon was, or may be, it was very real to me that night. I've since moved away from my old home. The old mesquite woods have been cut down. Houses are now on every side. I occasionally have sleep paralysis episodes, but I have never again experienced any strange happenings that plagued the little yellow house near the dead end.
This is Juan.
And this is Heidi.
From Denver, Colorado.
And we want to wish everybody a happy Halloween.
And take
care.
The story comes to us from Martha in Arizona. The Digging Witch in Yuma, Arizona. I'd been living with my mom at Nana and Tata's house for 2 years at the time this first experience happened. I was standing close to an open curtained window in my grandfather's room. My mom, who was using the natural light, was doing a decent job of brushing and styling my hair for a school day in kindergarten year. It was probably a very routine morning. That is, until I saw a face in the window. It was not an ordinary face. It was a face that I could only equate with that of a witch's face. She had greenish-gray skin, long, scraggly hair, and freaky eyes that seemed to glow and twirl in the oddest manner. I don't recall if I screamed at first and then was quietly transfixed, or the opposite. But when I wouldn't respond to my mom's questioning, she didn't see anything, but did say I pointed out the window. She ran outside to investigate and saw nothing out of the ordinary. But as she was outside, looking into what could be causing me so much anxiety, this witch lady was hovering back and forth in the window, knowing fully well she was scaring the daylights out of me. When she hovered farther away from the window, she immediately began digging a hole in the ground and pointing at it and just giving me the most grimacing smile you can imagine. I have no idea how long this encounter lasted, but she did eventually fade away, and my mom came back to me, telling me she saw nobody outside. I have no idea why our family dog, who was out in the yard, didn't bark even once. I told my mom I saw a witch, and that she was digging a hole and pointing and laughing at me. She said she saw no witch and no hole whatsoever. But after that incident, I made sure not to have those curtains open all the way. This was the first of many spooky things I'd experienced at my grandparents' house in Yuma, Arizona.
Hi Lex and Anything Ghost listeners, this is Roger from Alberta, Canada, with a very appropriate Halloween story for you. This happened in the early 1980s. We were living in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, basically, in a beautiful little valley. Our nearest neighbor was about 2 miles away. It was nighttime. My mom and I were home. There were maybe 2 lights on in the living room. We were watching TV. So I'll set the scene for you. My mom's sitting on the couch. Her back is to a wall. The couch is up against a wall. To her left is an armchair that's facing perpendicular to her. And I'm sitting on the floor with my back against that armchair, fairly close to the TV. So from where I am, I'm maybe 6 feet away from the TV, maybe 8 feet. To the left of the TV, there's a doorway. And through that doorway is the kitchen. But before you get to the kitchen, to your left, there's a door that leads down to the basement. So we're sitting there watching TV, and out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement near the basement door, the bottom of the basement door. So I looked over there, and a black shape came up from the basement, formed itself into a cat, and this black cat silently walked into the kitchen and disappeared. Now, I blinked for a few seconds, and I said, "Did you see that?" And my mom said, "That black cat that just came up from the basement?" I said, "Yes." Well, the reason I was surprised was twofold. Firstly, we didn't own a black cat. In fact, we didn't have a cat at all, and there was no cat in the house. And secondly, the basement door was closed at the time. It was never open. It was always closed unless you're either going into the basement or coming out. This cat, this shape, had come up in the gap between the bottom of the door and the floor. This black shape came up through that little tiny space, materialized into a black cat, and then walked into the kitchen without making a sound. Well, we got up and we went into the kitchen, turned the lights on, looked everywhere. There was no cat. And I don't think either of us expected to find a cat because we both knew exactly what we had seen. A cat who comes up in the tiny space, quarter-inch or so, between a floor and the bottom of the door isn't likely to be in the kitchen when you go looking for it with all the lights on. Well, it wasn't Halloween when it happened, but it's a black cat story, and it actually happened many years ago now. So, happy Halloween, everybody, and thank you, Lex, for everything you do. Take care.
Yeah, this is a story from Greg in Connecticut. The abandoned house on Halloween. There was a house in my neighborhood that had been abandoned for my whole childhood. It was a green, old house, and no kid in the neighborhood could remember the last time someone had lived there. During games of capture the flag, kick the can, or hide and go seek, the house always felt creepy. And being kids, rumors started that it was a haunted house or that somebody had died there. There was a light in the enclosed porch that, like the rest of the lights in the house, was never on. Not many kids would hide in that yard during games played in the dark, but the neighborhood was always very festive during Halloween. While out playing during crisp, cool October nights, there was always an excitement leading up to the trick-or-treating at the end of the month. When I was in 6th grade on Halloween night, my friends and I went trick-or-treating. We made our way down the street toward the greenhouse and noticed something was different. The porch light was on.
This is Kat Williams from Mobile, Alabama, wishing y'all a super happy Halloween.
This story is from Megan in Columbus, Nebraska. A lifetime haunted. I grew up in a house in Texas that was over 100 years old. It had belonged to my grandparents before we moved in. There were always strange, small things happening in the house. Lights would flicker. Doors would close by themselves. Objects would move or fly off shelves. and my music box would begin to play without ever being wound. There was a lot of tension in my family, first with my aunts, father, and grandparents, which still persists today, and then between my father, my siblings, and I, which led to my estrangement from my father. My room seemed to get the worst of the activity. The spirit would open the blinds in the morning as though it were telling me to wake up. And once, when my father was yelling at me, it slammed my door shut on him, for which I got blamed and punished, even though I was nowhere near the door of my bedroom. Looking back on our old house, I can see now that whatever was there may have been trying to protect me, even if I didn't know that at the time. My parents are very religious and believe that all spirits are demons, and the spirit appeared that way to my father on several occasions. He once told me about a large shadow figure who tried to intimidate him. He yelled at it and began to pray until it walked out our door. I had terrible anxiety until I moved away at 23. And when I lived in the other house on the property, I refused to enter that house alone under any circumstances. I would not take my children there. A few years later, I lived with my grandmother in her mobile home about an hour away from the old house in a rural area. She purchased the home in an estate auction. She mentioned several times to us about seeing an old man wearing khaki pants. She spoke to her brother of the man who had owned the home and found out that he had died there. My son and I shared a room, and I would often hear my son laughing and playing with someone, but there was no one else in the room. I occasionally saw lights flicker and caught a brief glimpse of an old man standing behind me in the bathroom mirror. I never felt like the man was a bad spirit, just lonely, as he must have been in life. When my grandparents and I moved into a larger house, my aunt moved into the mobile home. She also saw the man, as well as the spirit of a white cat. My husband and I later moved to Nebraska to a large house that was built in the 1920s. Here I have seen a child run past the bathroom door and often feel a presence, but this one isn't malicious. Whatever is in this house is good, and we have had many good things happen to us since moving here. Colin in New Orleans, Headless Ghost.
I was 5 years old when my family moved into a simple, ivy-covered house outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. The house was built in the 60s and had nothing about it that would get it cast as a haunted house in even the lamest of ghost stories. But the land around the house has a long history due to the road being one of the oldest routes through the state. I suspect it is the history of the land that gave me my story. I can clearly recall the sunny morning in the room I shared with my brother. As I was blinking my eyes awake, I looked across the room to the bright window. That's when I saw a woman sitting cross-legged on the edge of my brother's bed. At first it seemed awkward that she was facing the wall, and then it registered that her body was like still smoke in the sunlight. She was completely nude, and she was headless. Of course, I pulled the covers over my head to hide from the sight, and after a few minutes of trying to keep my frantic breath quiet, I looked again to find her gone. My mother said she almost fainted when she heard me telling my brother I'd just seen a headless woman sitting on his bed. Not just because this is a scary thing to hear a child say, but because just the week before my father had seen the headless woman, this time clothed, glide out of their bathroom to lean over my mother, then stand up and vanish. This started a conversation about ghosts and hauntings in my family, where I found out about my grandmother seeing spirits as a young girl, and of family friends having interactions with ghosts. And it started a lifelong interest in the supernatural for me. I began to read everything I could about ghosts and haunted places, but reading really doesn't touch the reality of seeing. Like the Saturday morning, I woke up early and took my pillow and blanket into the den to watch cartoons before anyone else got up. I had only 1 foot on the carpet of our TV room when I was shocked still by the sight of the woman, again sitting cross-legged, again nude and headless, in the middle of the room. I was instantly through the door with the lights on, my blood pounding in my ears, in the hopes that she would not come through the door after me. After a while, when I could, I looked into the room to find it empty and the sun coming up. That was the last time I saw the apparition, but not the last of our interactions. And I can't recall the number of times as I entered and went through my teens that a light would flicker back on after I had turned it off, or the TV would come back on as I was leaving the room. I never felt any malice from her, and it was a pretty gentle haunting. My father recently recalled seeing a hanging plant bouncing by itself in an empty room. Spooky, but not scary. At least not until the night of my 15th birthday. I had 3 friends stay over to celebrate. We had set up the tent in the backyard so that we could stay up and be loud without disturbing my family, but there was a pressure in the air that night, and a low fog coming up from the creeks nearby. And though they weren't a fixture of my stretch of the highway, we could hear a herd of cattle lowing through the quiet country night. This atmosphere outside stirred my friends up a little, and so we decided to go into the den to watch TV until we fell asleep. But that never happened. Dean, Pat, Bobby, and I were sitting in a close circle, talking out our teen ideas with the TV murmuring behind me when I saw Dean and Bobby jump in unison. Dean hoarsely whispered, "Dude, did you hear that?" And Bobby replied, "Shut up, just shut the F up, you didn't hear nothing." Pat and I started excitedly asking what they had heard because we had heard nothing at all. And they said that they had heard a girl say my name. Of course, sounding like the little girl from Poltergeist. We thought it might be my sister, so I went to check, but she was fast asleep. And so we sat and talked about anything else we could think of to distract us from the scare and ease the tension. But then somewhere in our ramblings, 1 or 2 of them, I can't remember, heard a crying that turned to laughter. And that's when I became frightened. Lights turning on and seeing quiet figures in the middle of the room, even headless ones, was one thing. But crying and laughing in the middle of the night was quite another. We didn't know what to do but to stay put and talk a lot. Eventually, Pat and I had to use the bathroom, of course. And so it being my house, my ghost, I had to go first to make sure the coast was clear, even though I wasn't feeling all that brave. After making it to the bathroom without incident, I headed back to the den. I saw Pat waiting in the dining room, and as soon as I saw him jump like a rabbit, up and sideways through the door into the den. When I got in there, he was telling my friends about how he had heard a gasp, looked over, and saw in the coat rack mirror a person in a Civil War uniform standing next to him who was headless. None of us slept or moved that night until we got up to call a friend's father to come get him at 5 a.m, and I don't recall any of them staying over after that. And the rest of my teen years passed as I've told, with flickering lights and TVs coming back on, and me wondering why she called my name, but I didn't hear her.
You most likely are listening to Anything Ghost because you enjoy podcasts, and especially because you love podcasts with paranormal or ghost-related stories. That being agreed upon, I have no doubt at all that you'll enjoy a new podcast that has just arrived in time for Halloween. Haunted Places. Haunted Places is a well-crafted podcast where the host, with a campfire-style approach, delves into why what once was a normal place has turned into a resting ground for the paranormal. The host will take you back in time and go over events that led up to the place's haunted history. A new episode comes out every other Thursday, and in each episode, the host, with the help of a team of researchers, will take you on an audio tour of a different haunted place. Currently, you can listen to the story behind the Cecil Hotel and Marie Laveau. And like I said, if you're a fan of anything ghost, you're going to love this podcast. So visit Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts and search for Haunted Places. That's HAUNTED And be sure to subscribe now so you can listen to the new episodes on the Eastern State Penitentiary and more, so you don't miss anything. And actually, another thing you can do is you can listen online right away. If you go to parcast.com/haunted, it's PARCAST.com/haunted, and start listening and get your every other Thursday fix of haunted places. This is a story from Marissa in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Charlie No Face, a local legend. There's an infamous urban legend in western Pennsylvania, specifically in Beaver County, which is where I grew up. I first heard the story from a kid named Robert that lived down the block from me. He was an older boy and was part of a group of bullies that hassled me and other younger kids in my neighborhood. Trying to scare us, he told us the story of Charlie No Face. According to him, Charlie was a soldier who was killed by a grenade explosion during a gruesome battle. The grenade had exploded so close to him that it tore his face right off. We were told that the ghost of Charlie still roams the earth today, searching for his lost face. Robert then warned us to close our bedroom windows at night. Otherwise, Charlie's ghost, still dressed in his army fatigues, will crawl through the window and whisper, "Where's my face?" Why would Charlie's ghost crawl into open bedroom windows to scare children? I don't know. But Robert was older than me, and he knew how to ride a skateboard, so I was inclined to believe him. Robert's version of the story was a really unusual telling of Charlie's story, though there are many variations to it. Some tell of a young boy that climbs a tree to retrieve a kite or look at a bird's nest. The boy either touches an electrical wire or is hit by lightning and becomes horribly disfigured. Some stories refer to Charlie as the Green Man. Usually, the Green Man's origins have to do with a working man in an industrial accident. Sometimes he's electrocuted while repairing a utility pole. Sometimes he falls into a vat of acid in a factory. These industrial accidents disfigure his face and tint his skin a sickly green. Regardless of how he suffered this horrible disfigurement, it's said that if you drive down a certain road in the middle of the night, you can catch a glimpse of old Charlie No Face walking along the roadside. Though this may seem like an old urban legend, it's not. Charlie No Face was real. His name was Ryan Robinson. As a child, in 1919, he suffered a horrible accident after coming in contact with the trolley's electrical line. Just like the stories say, he was electrocuted and disfigured, losing his eyes, nose, and right arm. As an adult, Robinson would take long walks at night along New Galilee Road, near his family's property. Sometimes, in exchange for a beer or cigarettes, he'd stop and have a chat, often with eager teens who were investigating the urban legend. It wasn't until I was older that I found out the true story of Raymond Robinson. My best friend's mother assured us he was real. She worked at the geriatric center where he lived in his final years. It fascinates me how a real person's life became an urban legend while they were still alive. He was being made mythical while he was just minding his own business on his nighttime strolls. Perhaps after sharing this story, some bored teens out in Beaver County will listen and take a drive down New Galilee Road where Robinson used to walk. Some say, if you're really lucky, you can see his ghost walking by the roadside. If you do, leave some cigarettes and beer out for him.
Lex, this is Dustin out of Richmond, Virginia, wishing you and my niece and nephew, Kaylee and Carter, a happy Halloween.
Here's something from Sam in Austin, Texas. It's not a real ghost story, but it's pretty creepy. It's called The Limping Woman of Dripping Springs. About 15 years ago, I lived in Dripping Springs, near Austin, in the Texas Hill Country. The area is rolling hills covered by live oak and juniper forest. My wife had horses on our property as a hobby, but keeping them was expensive, so she started a side business selling saddles and other horse equipment to help cover her expenses. One autumn night, my wife asked me to deliver some horse tackle to a customer who lived in the nearby country. I had a cell phone, but this was before smartphones with maps, so I went out without a clear idea of how to get there. I ended up getting lost. I remember going down a road that crossed a stream, dipping into the water. In the moonlight, I could see the water going over the road, but I nervously crossed it and eventually arrived at a ranch with towers flanking the entrance. The towers had live flames at the top, which was creepy but interesting to me. I realized I was lost, though, and I tried to get back to where the stream crossed the road. My attempts to get back kept returning me to the gate with the flaming towers. After 3 attempts, I finally got to the stream crossing and managed to get a cell phone signal to call my wife and ask for better directions. The next time she asked me to deliver a saddle at night, a few weeks later, I refused at first, not wanting to get lost again. She told me, though, that the address was in the town of Wimberley, not in the country, so it would be easier to find. Also, this was an expensive saddle, and the woman buying it had previously backed out of the purchase, so she wanted to make the sale before the woman changed her mind again. I reluctantly agreed, but sure enough, I had trouble finding the place, and by the time I had delivered the saddle, it was past 10 p.m., and I had to drive back home down a very dark, desolate country road. This time, there was no moonlight. I was nervous about hitting a deer, which had happened to me earlier that year, so I drove slowly and with my attention on the woods to each side. It was then I noticed a woman, walking with a limp on the side of the road, going in the same direction I was. She was wearing a dress and walked gingerly, as though she was in pain. I slowed down and pulled up just ahead of her. Something felt very wrong. I immediately suspected this might be a carjacking attempt, and that the woman might be a decoy with some bad guys hiding in the woods. So I kept my car locked and rolled down the window far enough to talk to the woman when she came up to my car. I asked her if she was okay. She said she had been injured in a car crash and needed a ride into town. My first thought was, what car crash? I hadn't noticed any cars on the side of the road, and, because of my fear for hitting deer, I'd been very watchful. I told her as much, and asked her where the car was, and she said it was on another road. I then asked her if anyone else was involved in the crash and needed help. She said her son and daughter-in-law had been in the car that crashed, but were not hurt, and were already gone. She then added that they had crashed the car on purpose to try to kill her, but that she had survived. She asked me to let her in and give her a ride to town. Again, something felt very wrong, so I told her I couldn't, but that I would call 911 for her. She immediately said, "No, don't call anyone, just give me a ride." I pulled away and stopped down the long road, long enough to call 911. As I traveled home, I passed an ambulance heading in the direction from where I had come. Something tells me they did not find her. A couple of years ago, I told this story at an office Halloween party, and a colleague who now lives in that area said, "Oh, that was the crazy lady of Dripping Springs. She is known for hitchhiking and attacking people who give her rides. She's been in and out of mental institutions and jails. Well, probably so. The woman did sound very real and not like a ghost. But what would even a crazy person be doing in the middle of nowhere, late at night?
Anything Ghost. Flashback. June of 2007.
Here goes. My name is Laura, and I'm from San Francisco. In 1997, I was living in Ithaca, New York, where my mother and my two half-brothers live. I had been living with a good friend in a two-bedroom apartment, but our schedules didn't really overlap. In mid-September, I decided to find a new place to live. I wasn't making much money at the time, so I decided to move into a very small efficiency studio on the edge of town. It was in a large apartment complex that was probably built in the 1980s. It was new, pretty shoddy construction, essentially built as low-income housing. My apartment was on the ground floor. It was basically one large room with a small bathroom and small closet-style kitchenette off to one side. At the back of the room was a large closet with sliding mirror doors on it. It wasn't great, but the price was right. I moved in on October 1st, 1997. At first, I really liked having my own space. I had been living with my roommates for so long that I really enjoyed coming home to the solitude and the fact that there was no mess or dirty dishes because I'm sort of a neat freak. The only downsides to the apartment, which I noticed right away, were that when I came home after work every day and walked in the door, when the room had been shut up all day, there was a faintly sick, sweet odor. It was like rotting leaves or garbage. Since I'm a very clean person, this frustrated me. I knew there was no garbage and that all the surfaces were clean. I would open the windows and I burned scented candles, which dispelled the smell temporarily, but whenever I came home after being away for a few hours, it was back again. The other thing about the apartment that became more and more of a problem as October gave way to November was that it was very, very cold. I chalked this up to the fact that it was a cheaply built building. It had poor or no insulation, and the carpet was just this thin indoor-outdoor type. The thing was, even in November, when the temperatures were beginning to fall, it was often warmer outside than it was in my apartment. I decided that this was because a bad designer had placed the electric heating unit along the wall under the only window in the apartment, which meant that all the heat was being sucked right out of the insulated window. This is where the story gets difficult to tell and why I've had to work up the courage to tell it. As maybe many of your listeners know, paranormal events seem to happen at times when you're particularly sensitive to them. Between November and December, I began to feel more and more depressed and became more reclusive. This is not like me. I'm pretty outgoing. Though I do enjoy my solitude and my time alone, I like to read and write a lot. Family and friends have always been important to me. But during mid-November of that year, I began to feel a crushing depression. The thing is, I had a history of depression. When I was 15, I had tried to take my own life, and I had been in therapy for many years after that. When my mood and thoughts began to turn darker and more filled with despair, I really thought I was just experiencing another round of a cycle of depression. I knew that eventually it would pass, so I just tried to buckle down and endure this round of it. Around the end of November, beginning of December, a couple of things happened that did not seem strange at the time, but later made a lot of sense. First of all, I had been getting a lot of junk mail, but somehow the companies that were sending me the mail had got my name wrong. The first name and middle initial were correct, and the first part of the last name was right, but the last name was slightly different than mine. I thought that somehow I must have ended up on one of those mass marketing lists somewhere, and they had just typed my name in wrong. The mailboxes for the whole apartment building were on this island in the middle of the parking lot out front. Whenever I walked out there to get my mail, I would wave to this perpetual group of teenagers that hung out in front of the building, gossiping and smoking. I remember thinking what jerks they were because whenever I came out there, they got quiet and seemed to be waiting for me to leave. When I left, I'd hear them start whispering to each other. But teenagers are teenagers. I just shrugged it off. But it definitely added to this atmosphere of depression and isolation that was weighing more and more heavily on me. A similar thing with the junk mail was happening with telemarketers calling on my phone. This was before the federal no-call list, and at least twice a week I was getting calls for someone with my same first name but a slightly different last name. The first 2 weeks of December, things got worse. My mother and I had had a falling out and she wasn't speaking to me. I think it was over some advice I had given my oldest half-brother and that she had taken issue with. I spent all my free time alone in my apartment, lying in bed and reading. I didn't have a TV. It was so cold that I used an electric blanket for heat, which worked better and cost a lot less than the electric heat in my apartment. I was very down over the fight with my mother, but I didn't want to talk to anyone about it. When my friends came by, I ignored their knocks and pretended I wasn't home. I didn't answer the phone, and I didn't return anyone's calls if they left a message on my machine. That was when I had the first dream, if you can call it that. Even now, comparing it to all the dreams I've had in my life, it's definitely different. I was awake, but I was in that state between awake and asleep where you're still aware of your surroundings but aren't completely alert. That was when I heard a woman say to me, "I need your help." I thought to myself, I am dreaming. So I thought back at her, "Why do you need my help?" She answered, "I'm stuck here and I can't get out." I remember feeling very, very cold and the most intense kind of black unhappiness I had ever felt in my life. It was the bleakest sensation of being utterly alone and utterly devastated. I thought in my head to her again, "But how can I help you?" She answered, "I need you to carry me. I need to attach myself to you so that you can carry me out of this place. I can't do it on my own." Even in the half-dreaming state I was in, what she said scared the heck out of me. I knew in some part of myself that it would be very bad to say yes to her. But another part of me believed that all of this was just my own imagination and part of my own depression, that I was slipping so far down this time that maybe another part of myself was appealing to me for help, that maybe I was just carrying on a conversation with my own psyche. That was when I decided that I would say yes, because I wanted to help myself. I thought back to the voice, "All right, you can do it. I will help you." I slept through that night. When I woke up the next morning, it was snowing. I felt a strange sense of not being really connected to myself, like I was watching myself get up and make coffee, wash my face, etc. I think it was a Sunday. I remember I didn't have to go to work that day. And this is when the story gets really strange and frightens me even now. For some reason, after I drank my morning coffee, I went into my closet and got out a pile of clean white sheets. I had about 5 or 6 of them. Standing on a chair, I tacked them to the ceiling with push pins so that they hung down around my room, sort of like artificial walls made out of white sheets. I put them up at right angles to each other so that they formed a kind of tunnel that went from my bed to the front door. Even now, I have no idea what possessed me to do this. It is so completely weird that it's embarrassing to admit even now. After I had tacked up the sheets, I crawled into my bed with a box of cookies. I knew then that I was going to kill myself. The idea just came to me all of a sudden as if it were the obvious solution or just a very simple thing that I needed to do. Just then, my phone rang and the answering machine picked up. It was my mother. She said, "Honey, please call me. I'm sorry. I'm worried about you." I sat and looked at the phone for a long time, and then I picked it up, and then I put it back down. I got up and got the phone book, and I looked up a suicide prevention hotline, and I called. I talked to the woman on the other end for about an hour. I didn't tell her about any of the weird things that had happened. I really thought that I was losing it, that I had gone crazy. I just wanted to hear the sound of a voice that was not judging me, somebody who didn't know me. After she talked to me for about an hour, she gave me the number of a local sliding scale counseling center and made me give her my word that I would call them as soon as I hung up with her. I did. I made an appointment to see someone the next day. The rest of that day was really difficult for me. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the apartment. While doing so, I discovered something that really scared me. All along the edges of the windows and on parts of the mirrored closet door, I discovered a kind of black mold that had begun to grow. I thought at first it was just discolorations on the mirror or in the wood that framed the windows, but when I looked closer, I realized they had the circular, spattered pattern of mold. I had a degree in biology, so I knew that it was mold, but I had never seen this kind before. I went to the counseling session the next day, and the woman I spoke to told me that she wanted to work with me twice a week for as long as we needed. I began to talk to her about a lot of secrets and deep troubles that I had been carrying around with me for years. I was put on antidepressant medication. Within a few weeks, I was starting to feel better. The atmosphere in my apartment was still bad. I still noticed the smell, but I took down the weird sheets and started spending more time with my friends. My mom and I patched things up. I began to believe that all of the strange events, my strange behavior, and my experience with the woman's voice who asked me to help her had been symptoms of my depression. I was slowly rising back out of the paralysis I had felt. In January, I was on my way across the parking lot toward my apartment one afternoon when the property manager, who was standing on her balcony on the second floor, called out to me and waved me over. We introduced ourselves to each other, and when I told her my name, she looked startled. She asked me a few questions about whether or not I was happy with the apartment or not. I told her it was okay, but it was cold and a little bit lonely. She said, "Can I ask you a more personal question?" I felt a little strange, but I thought, why not? "Yes," I said. She said, "Do you notice anything strange about your apartment, like a funny smell or anything like that?" I have to say that at that moment I felt that strange feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up. I knew that she was about to tell me something that I both wanted and did not want to know. I told her yes, that I did sometimes notice a funny smell, but that I kept things very clean and burned candles and that it wasn't too bad, just when I first got home was when I really noticed it. "That's good," she said. "You just let me know if you need anything." Then she asked me my name again. I told her, and she said something like, "That's what I thought you said, but I thought I didn't hear you right." I knew there was something the woman wasn't telling me. For the next month, in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about that interaction. I decided that if I ran into her again, I would ask her for more details. On Valentine's Day that year, my dad and stepmother, who live in California, sent me a flower bouquet. They knew I didn't have a boyfriend, and they were just being sweet because they knew I had been down. Since it came in the middle of the day when I was at work, it was delivered to my upstairs neighbors, whom I had never met. Shortly after I came home, there was a knock on my front door. When I answered it, there was a man in his 40s standing there, holding the bouquet of flowers in a vase. "Are you Laura?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He gave me the strangest look and then said, "These came for you today." I took the flowers, but when I went to thank him, he turned away and almost bolted up the stairs. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. It was either the next day or a couple of days later that I was leaving my apartment when a little girl who lived in the apartment complex was riding by my door on her big wheel. Since my door was open, she stopped and looked inside. She was about 5 or 6 years old. "Hi," I said, "you can come in if you want." She seemed very curious about the inside of my apartment, but she shook her head and started backing away from the door, pushing with her feet to move her big wheel backward. I went outside and was locking my door behind me, and she was still sitting there on her big wheel. She said, "Did you know the lady that died?" I said, "What?" She said, "The lady that died," and pointed at my apartment. "A lady died there?" I said. She nodded. I squatted down so that I was at eye level with her. "When did this happen?" I said, but she didn't answer. She looked pretty scared. "That's okay," I said. "Bye-bye, I'll see you later." I went directly upstairs and knocked on the property manager's door. "Look," I said, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to ask you a question." She looked at me like she knew what I was going to say. "A little girl just told me that a woman died in my apartment. Is that true?" She looked at me for a few seconds and then she nodded. "I didn't want to say anything to you," she said. "The rental agency said that I shouldn't say anything." "What happened?" I said. "She committed suicide," she answered. "When?" I asked. "The day after Princess Diana died. I guess she was a huge fan of Princess Diana, and they think her death had something to do with it. Princess Diana died on August 31st, 2007, which was exactly a month before I moved in." The woman went on to tell me that the woman who committed suicide in my apartment was a recluse. She almost never came out of her apartment except to go shopping or when she had to. So they didn't find her body at first. It was my upstairs neighbors that started to notice a bad smell about 2 weeks later, and that's when they opened it up and found her. The woman told me the following. She said it was really bad. She had been decomposing for 2 weeks, and it was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. There was this black mold growing all over everything, the walls and the mirrors. They had to throw everything of hers away because it was covered with black mold. Honestly, I was feeling right then the way you probably feel right now listening to this. There is no way this could really be true. I had to have been making this up, but I'm not. Still, some part of me then, even with everything I had been through, didn't believe her. So here's what I did. I went to the Tompkins County Library and looked up the obituaries on microfiche for September of 1997, and I found her obituary. She was a writer from California. I'm from California, and I'm a writer. She was 20 years older than me, and her first name, middle, and last initial were the same as mine. With a photocopy of the obituary in my hand, I went to the rental agent's office. I asked her if it was true, and she admitted that it was. I asked her why or how she could possibly, in good conscience, have rented an apartment to me when I had almost exactly the same name as the woman who had committed suicide in the apartment only a month before I moved in. She didn't have a good answer, but she was very apologetic and offered to let me move into a different unit right next door. I did, but 1 month later I moved out of the apartment complex entirely. I didn't feel like a single wall between the two apartments was enough to really make any difference. I still don't really understand what happened to me. The circumstances of what happened were so intimately tied up in my own mental state and life that it's impossible for me to believe that this could really have happened to anyone else. It was as if I was meant to move into that apartment. But I'm not a person who simply believes things. The facts have to support the feelings. In this case, the facts are what made what I thought was a severe bout with depression into something I have no other way to describe as also paranormal. I realize this is a very long story. I hope you can share it with your listeners. If you have any doubt as to its truthfulness, I have a copy of Laura's obituary, and I'm happy to scan it and send it to you. Thanks, Lex, and keep up with the podcast. It's great.
And here's a story from Alana in Wisconsin. Ghost Children in the Hall. Back in 2006, my husband and I stayed at a B&B in Spillville, Iowa. Being one of the only B&Bs in the area, we were the only guests. Upon entering, my sixth sense kicked in, and I knew there were some kid spirits around. As we were walking around, the owner showed us our room and let us know that we were the only guest and that she lived right up the road if we needed anything. She laughingly added, "Don't be surprised if you hear kids running, laughing, or making noise. Those are just our all-around guests that never leave." And with that, she left us to ourselves to explore the rest of the B&B. Nothing odd happened that evening or through the night. But the next morning, as I was washing my face in the bathroom sink, I heard, above the running water mind you, the laughter, giggling, and footsteps of kids running up and down the hallway right outside our room. Face wash on, I turned off the water and ran to the door and yanked it open, only to find nothing and no one. Total silence. My husband, who wasn't fully awake at the time, says he didn't hear a thing. Although he did mention that in the middle of the night, he thought I was shaking him to get his attention. He just rolled over and muttered something and went back to sleep. I let him know that it was not me. I'm pretty sure those kids wanted to get our attention, as we were the only guests that day. And with my sixth sensibility, they knew I was someone they could communicate with to some degree. Today that B&B is no longer a B&B, and we haven't been back since. So I'm not sure if those kids are still around, running up and down the halls. This is a story from Jen in Utah. Lake Powell Ghost. About 15 years ago, my family, along with some extended family, rented a houseboat for just over a week's vacation on Lake Powell. There was quite a group of us, 12 in total, so some of us slept in tents on the top deck of the houseboat. The first place we stopped to camp was amazing. It had a beach and a gradually sloping red rock hill. Anyone that has a dog, a beagle in particular, knows that when you go someplace new, the first thing the dog wants to do is explore. I grabbed a walkie-talkie, put Snoopy on my leash, and we started making our way up the hill. When we got to the top, I stopped and looked around, enjoying the view. I could see the lake winding gently around us, and wished I had brought my camera. Snoopy sniffed and snorted around the top of the hill as I called my dad over the radio and said, "Hello down there." And he replied, "Hello," and added that he didn't realize how tall the hill was and that we looked like ants on top. We walked around and I watched the sun inch closer to the horizon. All of a sudden, I heard a voice very close to my ear say, "Hello?" Snoopy stopped sniffing the ground and stood looking around as if he'd heard it too. I could see everywhere there were no obstacles other than maybe a small cliff going down the hill. I knew there were no places for anyone to hide the way that we had come, and yet the voice had sounded like it was right next to us. I said hello back and continued to look around. I called to my dad over the walkie and asked if by chance he could see or had seen someone come up around us. He said, "Nope, just you two," and added that we should start heading back down since the sun was going down. As I had the conversation with my dad, Snoopy started pulling me back toward the houseboat as fast as he could. The rocks weren't really slippery, but I only had on flip-flops, and even though beagles aren't big, they sure can pull. Snoopy pulled me right out of my flip-flops a few times, so I just picked them up and walked down the red rock barefoot. When we got to the bottom, Snoopy wanted to get back on the houseboat ASAP. My dad asked what was wrong with him, and I just told him, I don't know, but it was weird up there. That night, Snoopy would not leave the houseboat at all. He ended up peeing on my pillow. In the morning, after seeing more than a few scorpions, we decided to shove off and explore more of the lake. We had so much fun amid the beautiful scenery, and created so many wonderful memories that I forgot about the first night. My cousins and brothers had to go back to work later in the week, so Snoopy and I were able to sleep inside of the boat on one of the couches, since there were only 6 of us left. On the second to the last morning, Snoopy woke up by pawing and whimpering as he looked out the window. My dad asked what he saw, and I looked out to see a man chest deep in the water standing at the front of our personal boat that was moored about 30 feet away. I told my dad someone was standing at the front of the boat. He was confused because the only other male there was my uncle. So I said, "It's Kevin." The moon was full and bright, almost like daylight, and the water was calm like glass. I continued to watch out the window with Snoopy as my dad yelled out the door, "I'll be right there. I just need to find my shoes." The figure waved at my dad, and I just watched, trying to figure out what was wrong with the boat. My dad walked out, and the figure waved again. At that point, I laid back down and tried to get some more sleep. I think it was about 3 or 4 in the morning. Snoopy continued to watch out the window. On the shore between the houseboat and our boat, there were 2 big boulders and a giant bush. So you had to walk carefully between the boulders and around the bush, making anything on the water side of the bush out of view. My dad told me later that as he passed the obstacles, he saw that no one was by the boat, and the water was still and glassy. He got on the boat anyways, and checked in and around it, and saw nothing was wrong, and definitely no one was around. He would have been able to see any movement in the water if someone had swam away. When he got back to the houseboat, he asked me if I had seen Kevin. I said, "No, where is he?" Dad ignored me and walked to the back bunk where Kevin had slept, and then just laid down on the couch across from Snoopy and I. I asked, "What is wrong with the boat?" And the only thing Dad said was, "Nothing." I asked where Uncle Kevin was, but got no reply. In the morning, over breakfast, I asked Uncle Kevin what was wrong with the boat, and he had no idea what I was even talking about. I again asked Dad what was going on, and the only thing he said was, "I don't know," and changed the subject. My dad has experienced things he can't explain, but he's not really a believer of ghosts and the paranormal. So when something unusual happens, he clams up and doesn't want to talk about it. On the long drive home, though, out of the blue, my dad asked me what I had seen. I instantly knew what he was talking about, because I couldn't get it off my mind either. I told him everything I had seen, and that I had laid back down because I figured the situation was handled. Then he asked me what Snoopy had done, because he had heard him whimper, and he looked back and saw Snoopy looking out the window as he approached the bush. Snoopy had stood looking out the window, whimpered and danced a few times, then grunted, yawned, looked inquisitively around both inside and out the window, danced some more, and then greeted my dad as he came back inside the houseboat. All these years later, I really wish I had continued to watch with Snoopy, because both my dad and I believe Snoopy had seen the ghost disappear. David in Chicago, Illinois, sends us Rainy Cemetery. It had been years since I went to the cemetery to visit my father's grave. I thought of him often, but actually getting in the car and driving to the cemetery wasn't something I did. It wasn't until I had children, and my children started asking questions about my daddy, that one day I explained that my father had died before they were born, and their grandpa is in the cemetery. One of my children asked if we could visit Grandpa in the cemetery, so one day we went. My father is buried in a cemetery in suburban Chicago that is directly across the street from another cemetery. The two cemeteries are affiliated through the Catholic Archdiocese, but are two separate cemeteries with different names. Like I said, it had been years since I'd been there, so I had forgotten which cemetery my father was in. My wife and 2 children and I traveled to the cemetery that I believed was my father's. I stopped at the office, and there was a computerized directory in the lobby. I typed in my father's name, and his location came up. So I printed a sheet with the map, and off we went. That day was overcast and raining on and off, so when I found the section on the sheet, I told my family to wait in the car until I found the row and plot. As I began to search, it started to drizzle again, and of course I didn't bring an umbrella, but I continued on since the section was not that large and the rain was only a drizzle. I found the row was listed on the sheet and counted the plots, but I could not find my father's gravesite. I started over, but again I could not find my father. There were not enough plots in the row my father was supposed to be in, and I was getting very frustrated. I gave up on the map and was just walking up and down the rows looking for my father's headstone. As I was searching, the sky began getting darker and darker. Soon, it began to rain harder and harder. It was early afternoon, and it looked almost as dark as dusk. The rain was now in a full downpour, and I was soaked through and angry. So I gave up, and I returned to my truck. Frustrated and angry, I decided we were going to go return home. But as we wound our way through the cemetery, we approached a small building on the grounds. My wife asked me to pull over and said she'd run in and ask for help. I said no at first. It was still raining heavily, and there wasn't any reason that both of us should get wet. But as I got close to the building, I pulled over, and my wife ran in. She returned a few minutes later and said that we were at the wrong cemetery. According to the man she talked to, my father was in the cemetery across the street. Because the cemeteries were affiliated, I was able to find my father's information, but whatever information the man looked at stated that my father was in the cemetery across the street. The rain had not let up, and it was still very dark. The entrances of the two cemeteries were directly across from each other. I crossed the street as I drove my truck through the gate of the correct cemetery, and the rain stopped, and it started to get brighter. It was almost like someone had turned a valve on a spigot, shut off the rain, and turned the lights on. I followed the directions the man in the building gave my wife, and there it was, my father's grave. We got out. I shared some stories about my father with my children and cleaned up his gravesite a little, and then we left. The whole experience left my wife and I a little freaked out. Neither of us claimed that the rain was my father's way of letting me know I was in the wrong place, but I have to admit the abruptness of the rain stopping and how quickly and instantly it got brighter when we entered the correct cemetery is at least a very odd coincidence. This is from Misty in the U.S., alone in the house. The following could have something to do with my vivid teenage imagination, but I will let you decide. The house that I grew up in was pretty small and built in the 1920s. There were no doors on the first floor, and an open stairwell ran up the center of the house to the second floor. The bedroom that I shared with my sister was upstairs, as was the only bathroom. We had no air conditioning, so when it was hot out, the upstairs could get pretty miserable. One summer night in the early 1990s, when I was 13, my mom had to drive to the airport to pick up my dad. My sister was sleeping over at a friend's house, and my brother was probably out doing some underage drinking and graffiti in an abandoned building somewhere. So I was going to be home by myself for a while. It had been a hot day, so I decided I would sleep in the living room on the couch, downstairs where it was cooler. After my mom left, I sat in the living room reading for a while. Eventually, I got tired and decided to turn in for the night. So I switched off the lamp and laid down on top of the sleeping bag I had put over the couch. As I lay there, in the darkness, waiting to fall asleep, I noticed after several minutes I could hear something. It was the sound of water running. I got up, turned the lamp on, and walked to the foot of the stairs. From there, it definitely sounded as if the water was on in the bathroom sink. After hesitating for a moment, I ran up the stairs, turned on the bathroom light, and went inside. Sure enough, the cold water was running full force. I turned it off, feeling a little shaken, and went back downstairs to the living room. I turned off the lamp and lay back down on the couch. As I tried to fall asleep, I heard it again. Water running. Surely, I thought, I was mistaken. Once again, I got up, turned on the lamp, and walked to the foot of the stairs. As I had feared, I could still hear the sound as clearly as before. "Hello?" I called up the stairs, then felt stupid. Did I think anyone would answer? Did I want them to? After standing there for several seconds, agonizing, I decided there was no way I was going up to that bathroom again. I ran back to the living room, where I'd left the lamp on, dived onto the couch, and buried my head under the pillow. I stayed there that way until my parents came home. They went upstairs to get ready for bed, and I waited for my mom to yell at me that the water was on, because she would have. But it didn't happen. My parents quietly finished their nighttime routine and retired to the bedroom. Eventually, I fell asleep.
Hi, Anything Ghost listeners. This is Alice from Bendigo, Victoria, Australia. Just want to wish everybody out there a very happy and spooky Halloween. And take care.
Hi Lex and Anything Ghost listeners. I wanted to share a story of something that happened to me not too long ago. Actually happened to my husband, I guess I should say. We live in a quiet area of Connecticut. It's very rural, it's very historical. You can pass houses that have been lived in by Nathan Hale, for example, and you can travel the Rochambeau Trail. It's really interesting, and it's really beautiful. So I was just, sitting at work and doing my thing, and I get a phone call out of the blue, and it's my husband, and he calls to tell me that he's seen a ghost. Now, I love the ghost podcasts. I'm crazy for them. Yours was the first I discovered, and so it's, of course, my favorite one. My husband just, I think, finds it amusing that I find it amusing. So he doesn't necessarily believe in ghosts, but he thought I would appreciate this. And I find it interesting because he doesn't really believe in ghosts. So the story is this. Okay, so every morning, when the weather's nice, he likes to take his bike out and he bikes around the countryside area where we live. And again, I said it's really rural, very quiet. So I guess that morning he had gone as usual, taken his bike. It was a beautiful sunny morning, and he was taking one of the paths he takes, which is about 8 miles of a ride around the house, from our house. And this particular ride, it goes past a really old cemetery. And the cemetery is on a rural road. It's not near anything. And it's just basically this little patchwork in a big field. And there's a couple of trees. So he's, I guess, riding his bike, and he's going along the road. And he uses this cemetery as his turnaround point, because it's sort of halfway from the distance he wants to ride that day. So he's riding along, and he sees this kind of old, black, squarish, he says it looks like a vintage long car. And it's big and long and boxy and black. And he sees it turn into the cemetery. And of course, he said, as he's telling me, he's like, he sees this and he's thinking, oh, great. Someone's going in, and so maybe, they're getting ready for a burial or what have you, and he doesn't want to interrupt them, and he's just also irritated because now he can't really use that place to turn around. So, it's only just a little ways ahead of him. He looks down for a second, and he looks up, and at that point he's ready to turn in, and he's like, and there's nothing there. It's just a quiet little patchwork. I mean, it's really little. You can see the whole place from where the road and from where you go in. And it's only got the one center little driveway, and then it's got a couple of branches that shoot off from it. So he gets in, and I guess he comes to a complete stop because he's thinking, oh, wait, where did this car go? So he thinks about it. He's like, yeah, there was really something there. It looked old-fashioned, and there was, and in that area on that road, there's no other options. I mean, there's no other roads that branch off right there. There's no driveways. That's it. And, it's just fields, and then, a couple of trees and the little patchwork of cemetery. Totally quiet. All he hears are birds. No cars driving by. No car past him. So he said, I have to call my wife because she'll get a kick out of this. And I did. And even after seeing it, he still sort of poo-poos it, like, he doesn't really have an explanation for it, but we have a lot of fun talking about it. So that's my story, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And while I've gone past that cemetery a lot of times since then, I've never seen anything, which I find ironic. But everyone, hope you have a happy Halloween season, and take care.
Nicole in Texas. Children crying in the alley. When I was younger, my family and I lived in a little white house with a big backyard in a quiet neighborhood. One night we came home late, and we heard what sounded like children crying, but we couldn't tell from where it was coming. My parents told us to just keep walking and get inside the house. Another night, we heard it again, but this time it was loud, and it sounded like it was coming from the backyard. So my dad walked around to the backyard and to the alley. My brother and I stood in the driveway with my mom until my dad came back. My heart was pounding, and I was so afraid of listening to the weeping children late at night. When my dad came back, he said he was able to hear the children crying in the alley, but there was nobody there. He said he called out, but there was no answer. About a week later, my aunt came over and blessed the home. After the blessing, we did not hear the children crying at night anymore. A story from Rees in Australia. the watch cat. My mom and I have always seen ghosts and had premonitions. She says it passes down in the women in our family. About a year ago, I woke up early in the morning to a shadowy figure with a wide-brim hat and a long scarf looming over my head. After about a moment of panic and dread, I thought perhaps I was having a sleep paralysis episode, which I'd never had before. I was trying to go back to sleep, but then my cat woke up at my feet. My cat is very calm, of sweet temperament. But when he woke, he looked directly at the shadow figure and started growling before hissing and raising his hackles. I was completely frozen in terror as I watched my cat raise his claw and the shadowy figure dissipated. I brought my cat up close, shaking and crying for several minutes, too afraid to move, but certain he had saved me. When I went down to breakfast, I told my mom about what happened. She went very pale, and then started curiously asking me if I knew of anything I may have done to let this being into our home. She told me then that I'd encountered it before, when I was a toddler, and thought that when we moved it had gone. I'm living on my own now since that incident, and I took my cat with me. I haven't seen the figure since, but sometimes I wake up to my cat growling into the darkness. Part 1 of the Anything Ghost Halloween special has come to an end. Download Part 2 and continue with the ghostly tales of Anything Ghost.